The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
Anarchism and the Nation in Cuba by Doyle. Understandings of the anarchist relationship to the nation are fraught with misunderstandings, disagreement, and tension, both historically and in the present day. This is not exclusive to anarchism, but a theme on the left more broadly. Benedict Anderson's exegesis on nationalism, Imagine Communities, argues that nationalism has proved an uncomfortable anomaly for Marxist theory, and precisely for that reason has largely been elided rather than confronted. A reflexive interpretation of anarchist philosophy would position the nation, as well as its corollaries of national identity and nationalism, in direct opposition to anarchism. Rudolf Rocker's seminal work, Nationalism and Culture, exemplifies this anarchist reading. In it, he critiques religion, statism, and nationalism as components of the same coercive apparatus. More precisely, he contends that both religion and the nation have been crucial to the state exerting control over its citizenry. Religion drew support by instilling the sense that people were dependent on it. In a world of suffering and sin, religion offered salvation and the promise of a gateway to a better life after death. In other words, it gave meaning to suffering, turning fatality into continuity. As religion was effectively synonymous with the state, this afforded the state control and legitimacy. As religion began to lose its hegemonic status, the large cultural system and forces which gave the state control over people became a role carried out by the nation in easing people's suffering and forging a national community. Anarchism, a philosophy firmly grounded in individual autonomy, not least through the right to organise and associate with others voluntarily, is critical of this. It views the nation as a concept which, in the same way as religion, is used by the state to create a community of dependent and subordinate subjects. Moreover, by creating communities based on national identity, it distracts workers from emancipatory forms of community based on class solidarity. However, the view that anarchism is rigidly opposed to the nation is misleading, both theoretically and historically. By distinguishing between the nation as an organic human impulse of attachment to the land, culture, and people, compared to the nation as a concept which is exclusionary, politicised, and endorsed by the state, some argue it is possible to harmonise anarchism and the nation. At this juncture, it's useful to draw on Pranay Somayajula's essay, episode 74 of Anarchist Essays, which suggests drawing a distinction between nationhood and nationalism, with the former compatible with anarchism and the latter incompatible. Arguing along the same lines, Yuri Gordon explains that nationhood, or the idea of a group identity extending from immediate kinship through common ancestry and mediated through language and culture, survives the critique of nationalism. Key anarchist thinker Mikhail Bakunin also described the process of identifying oneself with the nation by common people as a natural, real love. Importantly too, the nation has been a vector for emancipation of anarchist movements, thus complicating the doctrinaire rejection of nationalism as an elite, statist and conservative project. This has been the case in anarchist participation in anti-colonial national liberation movements, but also in the present day, as shown by leftist movements such as the Zapatista and Rojava revolutions, both of which combine anarchism with a form of nation-oriented discourse. Not only this, anarchism has, in practice, endorsed state-backed nationalisms. This occurred most emblematically during the Great War, in which a sharp division arose between prominent anarchists who supported the Allied forces, namely Kropotkin, and those whose anti-militarism precluded support for any state or collection of states, namely Malatesta. In this essay, I seek to steer attention towards showcasing how the complex terrain of anarchism and the nation was borne out in historical reality. Drawing on the example of the anarchists operating within 19th and 20th century colonised Cuba, I will show that the anarchists oscillated between viewing the nation as a necessary tool for combating colonialism and achieving independence, with maintaining a principled opposition to the nation. In this way, I use a real historical case to make 3 points. First, that anarchism has not always stood in opposition to the nation. Second, anarchist perspectives on the nation sometimes shifted according to the circumstances. Third, the case of anarchists in Cuba shows how unwavering opposition to the nation can be viewed as a Western-centric stance which does not translate neatly to the colonial context. As such, I support Chi Xing Li's argument in Essay 60 of Anarchist Essays, in which the argument is put forward that the anarchist tension with nationalism needs more rethinking. Cuba's modern history is defined by colonisation. Though the clutch over Cuba by the US is the most recent, and indeed most commonly associated colonial power over Cuba, the island was also colonised by Spain from the 16th century until the 19th century. In this essay, I'll focus on the end of the 19th and start of the 20th centuries. This was a period in which the US was tightening its grip over Cuba through trade and private investments, culminating in the political crystallisation of their control in 1898, when they militarily occupied the island and took the place of Spain as the new imperial power. The anarchist movement was attuned to these developments, and their commentary and actions in this period of changing imperial hegemony offers critical insights into how they engaged with concepts like the nation, nationhood, and nationalism. Alongside 1959, when the Socialist Revolution took place, 1898 is a key year for Cuba. It is viewed as the year in which Cuba achieved independence from Spain. When the independence movement to rid Cuba of Spanish colonial rule was gathering pace, the anarchists endorsed it, even fighting in the Liberation Army. On the one hand, the anarchists believed that a national liberation struggle which retained the nation-state should be opposed, as it would reproduce the same coercive forces of the state experienced under colonialism. At the same time, they viewed it as an important step towards achieving a fuller and more anarchist form of social revolution, whereby the state would be dissolved. Only through supporting the independence movement, which was gathering significant pace, could the anarchists hope to arrive at a position of strength whereby a fuller social revolution would be possible. In other words, the anarchists in Cuba understood their backing of the national liberation movement as a step towards achieving an anarchist society. The following quote by Luis Barcia, a key figure in Cuban anarchism, elucidates this logic. "I will fight for independence, and as soon as it is achieved, I will have completed my mission, and separating myself from the ranks of the army, which until that moment will have been a revolutionary one, I will return with full commitment to my life as an anarchist, continuing the fight for the ideal." This kind of alliance with a nation-centred mode of revolution, which in strategic terms is akin to a Marxist stagist conception of history, was propounded by Kropotkin. As Matthew Adams writes, Kropotkin suggested that national liberation struggles were a potential avenue for anarchist action, cautioning against a purity of principle that informed a self-defeating aloofness amongst revolutionaries, and favouring instead participation in national liberation informed by a particular reading of the historical process and a measure of the failures of anti-militarism. Beyond this tactical approach, there was also a sense that Cuban nationhood and the independence project itself was not antithetical to anarchist ideals. José Martí's independence movement, with Cuban identity or Cubanidad as its foundation, sought to create a society of equals. Indeed, this was prefigured in the demographic composition of the movement itself, which was not only a coalition of different groups bound together by a resolute opposition to the Spanish colonial power, but had strong foundations in Cuba's most oppressed groupings, namely the black population. Ada Farir stated that independence cannot be separated from efforts at black liberation in Cuba. Indeed, Afro-Cubans formed the backbone of the independence army. Though the nation as a unifying and equalising force was not the same as a movement founded on class consciousness, it did have parallels to the anarchist project and its values. By conceptualising the national liberation movement as springing from working classes and being geared towards dismantling hierarchy, the anarchist movement was able to square the concept of the nation with anarchism. Indeed, this continued even following the supplanting of Spanish colonialism by US imperialism. Cuban anarchists, cognizant of the expediency of independence for building its movement, incorporated national identity symbolism and discourse into the anarchist ideal in their challenge to imperialism. In Schaffer's words, whilst anarchist internationalism and Cuban nationalism were not compatible, anarchist internationalism and Cuban nationality, the island's local symbols, ideas and history, were complementary. The Cuban anarchist support of independence was not without scepticism and distance. Indeed, prior to adopting the position of allying themselves to the independence movement, the movement was embroiled in ceaseless disputes as to whether this kind of support for a nation-centred movement could be compatible with anarchism. How could an anarchist movement opposed to the existence of a nation-state support a struggle which sought to recreate this very structure? Indeed, some in the movement suggested that unshackling themselves from Spanish colonialism would not bring about any tangible improvement to the situation of workers. After all nation-states tend inexorably towards creating a society based on class antagonisms. So why would an independent nation-state be any different? In other words, the freedom which the independence movement promised would result from national liberation would be a narrow kind of freedom, one limited to political elites. The anarchists thought that regardless of whether they were under colonial rule or under the control of an independent nation-state, their socio-economic situation as workers would be the same. This was the same principled line put forward by Enrico Malatesta, who was in direct disagreement with Kropotkin. Indeed, Malatesta travelled to Cuba in the wake of the 1898 independence struggle. In a set of speeches, the anarchist expressed gratitude and praise for the anarchists who had fought in the anti-colonial struggle, but insisted that work remained to bring about authentic anarchist revolution, given that the expulsion of Spanish colonialists had not only led to a continuation of imperialism with US occupation replacing Spanish occupation, but also a perpetuation of capitalist relations of subordination and domination. Malatesta said, "Cubans have managed to reap very little from the expulsion of the Spanish government, because the Spanish capitalists who exploit them remain here. They remain subject to other capitalists, Cubans and Americans." He warned that a new capitalist state was being formed under the protection of the US. The wariness of certain anarchists of allying to the National Liberation Project was vindicated when the departure of the Spanish colonial power was followed neatly by a new one, the United States. At this point, the anarchist position reverted to a principled rejection of nationhood as a pillar of Cuban anarchism, instead insisting on internationalist class solidarity as the only form of struggle which anarchists could rely on to further their objectives of enacting social revolution and creating a classless society. This fitted with anarchist ideals of imploring revolutionaries to synchronise the means of their revolutionary approach with the ends. In other words, the objectives of a struggle must align with the methods used to achieve it. Moreover, the anarchists in Cuba were very preoccupied with what they viewed as the debilitating nature of national identity. It created antagonisms which divide men into irreconcilable enemies. This referred to the division amongst workers in Cuba based on nationality, which had become a key point of contention, with strikes failing due to feuds between Spanish and Cuban workers. As well as sowing division amongst the working class, they understood this as being of detriment to their aspirations of social revolution because, as one anarchist writes in a 1901 edition of El Nuevo Ideal, an anarchist periodical, it distracts the oppressed with the trickery of an external threat so that the workers don't feel pain at their slavery that is imposed by their own compatriots and don't rebel against them. In this vein, national identity-centred anti-imperialism, far from being a great leveller which helps workers to see how much they have in common, is construed as a nefarious tool designed to divert attention from exploitation by the Cuban state itself. In conclusion, unpicking the anarchists' relationship to independence and imperialism in Cuba opens up more nuanced understandings of the posture of anarchism vis-à-vis the nation. Given the common assumption of anarchism being incompatible with the nation on a theoretical level, and that anarchist movements have opposed it or ignored it in practice, this historical example complicates this line of thought. Not only did the anarchists engage rigorously with what the nation meant for their movement, they also supported a liberation struggle grounded in nation-centred philosophy. However, this position was not static. It shifted depending on the context, with the movement endorsing national liberation in the build-up to 1898, then rejecting it in the years following. Moreover, prior to the endorsement of a nation-centred project taking place, there was fierce discussion and disagreement amongst anarchists. This highlights how the anarchists did not shy away from a concept which did not align neatly with their philosophy, but sought to critically engage with it. In the context of colonialism and a movement which was gathering pace to topple it, the anarchists saw it as necessary to reconsider their doctrinaire stance of opposing any form of nation-centred discourse or strategy. This was on the basis that, although it did not seek social revolution according to anarchist ideals, i.e. dismantling capitalism and the state, the independence movement nevertheless represented an emancipatory struggle of working classes and could be a step in the right direction for arriving at anarchist objectives. This is a topic which holds importance not just for enlarging the corpus of scholarship on the nation within anarchist studies, but also to navigate contemporary events. As militarist and nationalist discourses become increasingly commonplace across the world, analysing the nation is becoming all the more pertinent for leftist currents. Punitive migration policies, racist discourses, and protectionist economics are becoming the norm for states across the world, leading Lucas Christodoulou to argue that this shift towards a more nakedly nationalist state is here to stay, not just a momentary aberration. Nuancing understandings of the anarchist critique of the nation and militarism can help to show the problems surrounding militarist responses, whilst also being careful to not fall prey to a knee-jerk rejection of nation-centred discourses and practices. The existence of movements which combine anarchist and nation-centred thought, namely the Kurds in Rojava and Zapatistas in Mexico, is firstly not a new combination in anarchist history, nor is it incompatible with anarchist principles. This also, therefore, makes inroads in suggesting that anarchism's dogmatic rejection of the nation holds some Eurocentric bias. Indeed, Xi Jinping explains that, in many Asian contexts, anarchism is a tradition strictly associated with nationalism. The Cuban anarchist case solidifies this notion by illustrating how revolutionary strategy is not necessarily aided by maintaining an unwavering rejection of the nation. Not only this, but given that the Cuban anarchist movement was predominantly Spanish, it is probable that the anarchist rejection of the nation and national identity carried with it a degree of Eurocentrism, not least given that Cuban workers were treated less favourably than Spanish workers under Spanish colonial employment practices. In the same way that Kinner and Adams' collection, Anarchism 1914 to 1918, chronicles the differing responses within the anarchist movement to the First World War, there are disagreements among anarchists as to how the movement should position itself vis-à-vis the war in Ukraine. This conjures up questions such as, is it a rigorous anarchist approach to support a cause which seeks to create a nation-state? Do the parameters of anarchist philosophy and strategy alter when faced with violent conflict and invasion? For example, does this kind of extreme context make it possible for anarchists to support armed nationalist resistance? Is it possible to temporarily support nationalist struggles as a movement seeking to create a classless and stateless society? And lastly, given that nationalism has been a cornerstone of many anti-colonial movements, including anti-colonial movements protagonised by workers, could it be a Western-centric viewpoint to reject the nation as anti-revolutionary and a tool of the oppressor?
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.